The HOA president thought she could destroy one man's peace, but she ended up destroying herself. Then one day she picked the wrong target, a quiet homeowner with a broken heart and a scarred Harley in his driveway. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The neighbors she'd ruled through fear were standing together. Cameras were rolling, lawyers were waiting, and her empire, built on intimidation and lies, was about to burn. The morning smelled like rain and cut grass. Garrett Trudeau stepped outside with a mug of coffee in one hand and the faint hope of a quiet sunrise in the other. The neighborhood of Pinehaven Meadows gleamed under that perfect suburban light. Fresh asphalt, trimmed hedges, and mailboxes lined like soldiers. For 3 years he'd told himself this peaceful place would help him finally stop chasing ghosts. But that illusion shattered the moment he saw the gasoline dripping from the scratched body of his Harley. 15 years of restoring that bike, gone in one night. The silver name painted on the tank, Miranda, now scarred by deep gouges that cut through the paint like claws. His late wife's memory desecrated by some coward. The air reeked of gas and betrayal, thick enough to choke him. Before he could think, a young man from across the street sauntered over, lean, cocky, and smirking like a hyena. "Shouldn't leave your trash out here, old man," the kid sneered, lifting his phone. "Yeah, 911? Guy at 42 Larkspur's threatening me." Garrett just stared, unblinking. The sirens weren't even necessary. He'd seen this type 1,000 times before in interrogation rooms. The kind who believed arrogance could shield them from consequences. But the difference was, Garrett used to be the one holding the evidence file. He wasn't some quiet retiree. He was a former ATF special agent, 22 years in Chicago, the kind of man who'd spent decades dismantling gun-running networks and laundering rings. He'd read criminals like open books, seen how power corrupted, and how fear made people sloppy. After his wife Miranda died of cancer, he'd walked away from the job. Not because he wanted peace, but because he'd lost his reason to keep fighting. The Harley they'd once dreamed of riding across the country became his anchor. Rebuilding it piece by piece was the only therapy that worked. Every bolt tightened was like whispering, "I'm still keeping my promise." Pinehaven Meadows was supposed to be the kind of community where the biggest argument was over lawn heights or mailbox colors. 140 homes, all identical enough to feel safe. Garrett had picked it precisely for that quiet predictability. He kept his grass cut, waved to neighbors, and helped Mrs. Kowalski next door carry her groceries. Nothing remarkable, nothing dangerous. Until she appeared. Deandra Callaway, the self-appointed queen of Pinehaven. 52, divorced, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and a tongue sharper still. She ran the HOA like it was her private empire, clipboard in one hand, judgment in the other. Deandra didn't just enforce the rules, she invented new ones when reality didn't suit her. Her power came from fear, from the way she humiliated anyone who stood against her in meetings. Garrett had seen cartel bosses with the same smug authority. The only difference was Deandra wore yoga pants instead of gold chains. Her son Jackson was a walking echo of that arrogance. 23, unemployed, always revving his modified Charger like he wanted everyone to know he existed. His criminal record might have been sealed, but his attitude screamed spoiled brat with immunity. And the moment Garrett parked his restored Harley in the driveway, Jackson's grin and Deandra's wrath both found a new target. The first notice came 2 days later, slipped neatly under the seat. "Motorcycles not permitted in driveways. $150 daily fine begins Monday." Garrett read it twice, then opened the HOA bylaws himself. Section 7C, motorcycles were explicitly allowed in driveways. He emailed the board politely, attaching screenshots, believing reason would end it. But reason doesn't work on tyrants. 3 days later, Deandra called an emergency board meeting. Her proposal? The Visual Blight Amendment, a rule requiring motorcycles to receive board approval for driveway parking. 5 board members. She controlled 2 through fear and 1 through guilt. The amendment passed 3-2. Overnight, Garrett's legal driveway spot became a violation. He didn't argue, didn't shout. Just sat on his porch that evening, sipping coffee as the cicadas hummed. and watched Deandra's lights burn across the street. The quiet hum of suburban life couldn't drown out the old instinct rising inside him, the one that whispered, "She just made a mistake." Because the Harley wasn't just a motorcycle, it was Miranda's legacy, a symbol of 31 years of love and loyalty. To scar that was to declare war. Garrett had spent decades making people regret their crimes, and Deandra Callaway was about to learn how it felt to become the case file. 5 days after the vote, the harassment began. At 6 a.m. sharp, the roar of Jackson's Charger shattered the morning calm. The sound vibrated the windows, followed by laughter fading down the street. The next morning, the same thing. Then came the trash bags, fast food wrappers, energy drink cans, one of them literally labeled with Jackson's name in marker, tossed near Garrett's lawn. Childish, sloppy, and perfectly predictable, Garrett didn't react. He installed a 4K surveillance system, discreet but fully legal under Indiana law, and documented everything. Dates, times, decibel readings, license plates, organized in a spreadsheet with the precision of an investigator who'd built federal cases for years. He knew how these games worked. You don't fight emotion with emotion. You fight it with evidence. A week later, he ran a background search. Jackson's record was a goldmine: DUIs, reckless driving, and a suspended license for unpaid fines, which meant that every morning, that kid was committing a fresh crime right outside his door. Garrett smiled for the first time in days. He wasn't just defending his pride now, he was building a case. But Deandra wasn't finished. One evening, Garrett came home to find a certified letter in his mailbox, $600 in accumulated HOA fines for motorcycle storage. The letter bore Deandra's signature under the title HOA President. Only problem? She wasn't president, she'd forged authority. In Garrett's world, that wasn't just unethical, it was fraud. That night, under the golden wash of his porch light, Garrett opened a new folder on his laptop. He labeled it Operation Callaway. Inside, he stored photos, emails, footage, and the scanned letter. He knew how this story would go. People like Deandra always believed intimidation would save them. They never understood that some men have spent their lives turning arrogance into evidence. And Garrett Trudeau had just found his new case. The sound of Jackson's Charger had become the neighborhood's unwanted morning alarm. 6 a.m. sharp, without fail, the engine screamed through the cul-de-sac like a dying beast. Windows rattled, dogs barked, and Garrett lay still in bed, calm and waiting, as the sound faded down the street. Every rev was another line on his growing list of evidence. The camera footage was crisp, time-stamped, indisputable. Each clip joined a library of misdeeds, trash dumped, taunts shouted, that arrogant smirk flashing across the lens. The retired agent in Garrett wasn't dead. He was awake, patient, and quietly preparing a case no one saw coming. By the second week, the file was thick enough to make a prosecutor smile. Still, Garrett wasn't ready to move. He'd learned long ago that timing was everything. In the field, patience separated arrests from disasters. So he waited, documenting each incident while polishing the Harley in his garage at night. The smell of chrome polish and gasoline comforted him, a familiar ritual that kept his anger sharp but controlled. The gouges across Miranda's name on the tank still burned him like open wounds, but emotion couldn't lead this fight. Facts would. Then came the grocery store parking lot. Garrett had just finished loading his saddlebags when Jackson pulled in fast, blocking his exit with that obnoxious Charger. The kid stepped out, phone already recording, grin wide and stupid. "My mom says you're harassing her," he said, puffing his chest out. "Gonna get a lawyer." Garrett didn't even look at him. He secured the last bungee cord, movements slow and deliberate. "Son," he said, finally meeting Jackson's eyes. "I haven't called a lawyer yet, but when I do, you'll know." The smirk wavered. Garrett nodded toward the curb. "You might also want to check your parking. That yellow line under your tire means fire lane. Camera up there's catching a great angle." Jackson blinked up at the security camera, color draining from his face. A second later, he was back in his car, tires squealing as he fled. That night, another letter appeared in Garrett's mailbox, $600 in fines due in 10 days or the HOA would place a lien on his property. He stared at the signature. President, Deandra M. Callaway. Fraud, plain as day. She was treasurer, not president. That single line was enough to bring the house of cards down if handled correctly. Garrett scanned and saved it 3 times, filed it neatly with digital timestamps, and began reaching out to the board. Quietly. His first call was to Gregory Matsuno, the real HOA president, a tired man with the voice of someone who'd stopped fighting years ago. Over coffee, Gregory admitted what Garrett had suspected. Deandra controlled the board through fear. She said she'd make insurance problems for us, Gregory whispered, fingers trembling around his mug. I just stopped arguing. Next came Yolanda, the accountant. She hesitated before speaking, eyes darting nervously toward her driveway as if Deandra might be listening. Something doesn't add up, she confessed. Money leaves the HOA account every few weeks. Payments to a consulting firm I've never seen invoices for. When I asked, she shut me down. That was all Garrett needed. He started digging. Public databases, county clerk filings, bank records. The man still had his old investigative instincts. Within hours, he found it. Callaway Consulting, LLC. Registered to Deandra's address. Sole proprietor, Deandra Marie Callaway. Nearly $50,000 transferred from HOA funds in 18 months for services rendered. He leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the computer the only sound in the room. It was textbook embezzlement, small-town style, hidden under paperwork and arrogance. He'd seen cartel accountants use the same trick, just with more zeros. Garrett smiled faintly. You've really done it now, he muttered to himself. But before he could act, the night brought something worse. At 2:47 a.m., his phone buzzed with a motion alert. Half asleep, he opened the feed and froze. A hooded figure crouched beside the Harley. The posture, the build, even the swagger in his movements. It was Jackson. The kid dragged a key across the tank, slow and deliberate, gouging deeper lines into Miranda's name. Then came the screwdriver, stabbing at the ignition until metal shrieked against metal. Garrett's jaw tightened. He could almost feel the heat of that old rage, the kind that had ruined careers and haunted marriages in the bureau. But he stayed put. He watched, recorded, documented. When Jackson finally looked up and flipped off the camera with that smug grin, Garrett whispered, "Got you." At dawn, Jackson strolled over again, all fake concern and smarmy charm. "Morning, neighbor. Shame about your bike. Maybe you should park it inside like Mom says." Garrett sipped his coffee. "You looked right at the camera, 2:47 a.m., keyed the tank, punched the ignition, even flipped off the lens. That's felony vandalism, damage over $3,000. The color drained from Jackson's face. He fumbled his phone, voice shaking as he called 911, spinning lies about threats and illegal cameras. Garrett didn't bother stopping him. Let the law come. He had proof. Minutes later, patrol cars rolled up. Sergeant Nyland stepped out, a man Garrett recognized from his ATF days. "Trudeau? From Bridgeport Task Force?" The respect in his tone said everything. Garrett handed over the flash drive of footage. "Full evidence, time-stamped." Jackson's smirk was gone. Deandra arrived minutes later, disheveled in a bathrobe, shouting about privacy and harassment, waving papers like shields. But Nealon was unmoved. "Your son's under arrest for felony criminal mischief," he said flatly. The neighborhood watched through curtains as Jackson was cuffed and led away. Deandra's eyes burned with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. Garrett sipped his coffee, gaze steady. "I'm counting on that." The fallout came quickly. A new certified letter hit his mailbox days later. An emergency assessment, demanding nearly $6,000 per household for road repairs. But when Garrett called the township, they laughed. No permits, no repairs scheduled. He dug deeper into HOA bank statements and found the same pattern, tens of thousands quietly funneled to Callaway Consulting. Deandra wasn't just abusing authority, she was bleeding the community dry. Garrett knew what came next. Expose, document, and wait for the perfect strike. The law loved precision, not passion. That evening, he got a call from Sloan Beckett, a journalist from the Indianapolis Star who'd heard whispers about HOA corruption. "You bring documentation," she said. "I bring the spotlight." They scheduled coffee for the next morning. Meanwhile, Deandra fired her counterattack. A Facebook post on the community page labeling Garrett as an unstable veteran, warning families to avoid him. It was venom dressed as concern, and the comments poured in from her loyal clique. "He's dangerous, has PTSD. My kids are scared." But for every lie, Garrett had truth. Screenshots, timestamps, police records. A few residents even pushed back. Didn't her son get arrested? Didn't the cameras prove it? The narrative began to crack. He didn't engage online. He didn't rant or threaten. He simply gathered more evidence, like laying bricks for a foundation that would bury her empire. And as the quiet of another evening settled over Pine Haven, Garrett stood on his porch with a calmness that almost felt holy, because now it wasn't just about his Harley or his peace. It was about everyone Deandra had bullied, fined, and frightened into silence. The Kowalskis, the Brunellis, the quiet ones who'd paid out of fear. He looked at the scarred name on his tank, brushed his fingers over the gouged silver letters, and whispered, "Almost there, Miranda. Almost done." And somewhere across the cul-de-sac, Deandra paced behind closed blinds, still believing she was untouchable, unaware that every move she made from now on would only tighten the trap around her neck. The morning of the meeting carried that strange electric stillness that comes before a thunderstorm. Garrett stood in his garage beside the Harley, the air rich with polish and gasoline. Miranda's name gleamed again under the fresh coat of silver paint, every curve of the letter a vow kept. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about justice. Not just for him, but for everyone Deandra Callaway had crushed under her self-made empire. By 10 o'clock, the Pine Haven Community Center was packed. Deandra sat at the head table, dressed like a politician, her face carved with confidence she didn't deserve. Her followers lined the front rows, arms crossed, ready for her show. Garrett entered quietly, calm and composed, carrying a single briefcase filled with proof. Sloan's camera crew was already rolling from the back, pretending to film community coverage. The meeting began with Deandra's voice slicing through the air. "We're here to address harassment by certain residents," she announced, glaring at Garrett like she could burn him from the room. But before she could continue, Gregory Matsuno, the true HOA president, stood up and interrupted her. "I move to add an item," he said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Review of board finances and authority." A hush fell. Deandra stammered, "Out of order." But Yolanda raised her hand and said, "I second." The balance shifted instantly. The room belonged to truth now, not fear. Marcus Feinstein, Garrett's lawyer, stepped forward next. "I represent 8 homeowners," he said evenly, passing out folders filled with records, receipts, and signatures. "These documents show fraudulent fines, illegal amendments, and nearly $50,000 funneled into Callaway Consulting, a company owned by Mrs. Callaway herself." The crowd erupted. Neighbors turned pages, gasping, murmuring. Deandra lunged for the binders, shrieking, "Lies!" But Marcus didn't flinch. "All verified public record," he said. Then Garrett stood. He didn't need volume, the silence carried his words. "Your parking amendment? Invalid. You needed a community vote, not 3 board members. Every fine you issued is illegal." His tone hardened. "And that money you took? That's embezzlement." Gasps filled the room. Someone shouted, "She fined me for offense." Another, "She threatened to sue me over a flower bed." The truth poured out like floodwater, unstoppable and cleansing. Just then, a woman in a black suit entered and spoke clearly. "Deandra Callaway?" she asked. "You've been served." The envelope hit the table with a slap that echoed. 3 lawsuits, injunction, class action, audit. Deandra's hands trembled as she read, face draining of color. Gregory lifted his hand. "All in favor of removing Mrs. Callaway from the board?" Nearly every hand rose. The motion passed. Deandra's voice broke. You'll regret this. Garrett met her gaze calmly. You already do. She stormed out, the door slamming behind her, the sound of tyranny ending. Weeks later, justice arrived in ink and steel. Deandra was convicted of fraud and theft, sentenced to 4 years. Her son paid restitution and took probation, finally learning humility. Pinehaven changed. Financials made public, fines reviewed, authority shared. And that spring, dozens of motorcycles rolled through the streets for the first Miranda Trudeau memorial ride, engines humming where silence once ruled. Garrett led the line, sunlight glinting off the tank, Miranda's name shining bright again. The battle was over. The peace, earned. But when his phone buzzed with a message from another HOA victim asking for help, Garrett smiled softly, started the Harley, and said, "Send what you've got." Because justice, like the road, never really ends.